Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. After President Trump's speech at the United Nations today, talking about ending wars, or rather beginning them, or continuing them, um, after he had his meeting with President Zelensky and the other NATO country leaders, we can come to the conclusion that President Trump has totally flipped in his position on the Russia Ukraine war. If before he had the idea that this was not his war, that he was only there because it was President Biden's fault, it was President Zelensky's fault, we know that it really was his war because he was the one who originally armed the Ukrainian army with a lot of the military equipment that they use at the start of the special military operation. He talked about um, the Stinger rockets, which took out the tanks, and he talked with glee about how it stopped the Russians and killed Russians. And we knew right away when you listen to that language, you know that this is not somebody who's interested in peace. He's only interested in displaying power and displaying force. He doesn't like the language of dialogue. He likes the language of this is the two options you have. Either you accept exactly as I tell you, or I will destroy you. So this is the real face of President Trump, and it was actually easy to see before he was elected, because in 2024 he had already picked out General Kellogg, somebody who they had pulled out of the jungle in Vietnam and had some form of PTSD, still with the idea that any military conflict that the United States goes into, it can win. So we have this deranged general who has been pushing this war line between Russia and Ukraine, rather than finding the solution, which was actually has been there before the special military operation. It's called Minsk II. They even had the Istanbul Agreement, with which basically Ukraine had signed off on, and which had provided security guarantees. But anyway, Ukraine had no interest in resolving this conflict with anything other than um, uh, ethnic Russians need to get out of Ukraine. This is our country, and if they don't want to be here, they can go. So anyway, Russia was not going to have anything of this, allowing NATO to come into Ukraine, and allowing NATO to set up bases and putting missiles and all that. So anyway, this conflict could have been resolved a long time ago, and President Trump knows the avenue that needs to be taken to resolve this. The puppet government in Kiev is nothing more than that. It's being propped up by U.S. dollars, by U.S. military support. Zelensky is an actor. He's a comedian, kind of a bad actor. He's like a mediocre Benny Hill, and the kind of comedy that he did. And then at one point, NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, or USAID, or the State Department decided to clean up his image and try to make him a candidate to run Ukraine. He was going to be their puppet. So they created a television program or a movie, or I don't know what it was, but anyway, it was called The Servant of the People, and it was about this person who becomes president of Ukraine and becomes well loved and a hero. So they were going to clean up, all this this dirty comedy that President Zelensky was doing, and they were going to try to make him look respectable. So anyway, they had this TV program, and they presented him to the people with this fictitious party called the Servant of the People, and he present him as president. And then as soon as that program was over, then out of nowhere comes this new political party in Ukraine called the Servant of the People. And guess who their presidential candidate is? Zelensky. So Anyway, this is manipulation of of Ukraine 101, right out of the playbook. How to manipulate the people, how to create this fiction of democracy, and have your guy in office. So the U.S. had instigated the overthrow of the democratically elected government 2014. And well, let's not go through the whole history because this video could last forever and a day. But anyway, um, since 2022, February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine to protect the ethnic Russians and to keep Ukraine from falling into NATO's hands, which for them was an existential threat. Um, the initially the Russian military was inferior to the Ukrainian military, inferior in their leadership, in their military equipment, in the military force that they had in Ukraine. But like I say, this is an existential threat for Russia. They're not going to have a antagonistic government in Ukraine that is militarized and that would be there to carry out attacks on Russia. Nor are they going to tolerate NATO in Ukraine. So this was something existential for them, and so they call this special military operation. It's an operation which has special rules. They can't take out the leadership, so they can't take out Zelensky. They can't take out anyone else. They're only focused on soldiers, military industrial complex, and the military equipment. So anyway, we get the start of the special military operation in February 2022, and at the beginning, Russia had taken a lot of territory but had very few soldiers, maybe about 140,000 in Ukraine. Ukraine has a military of 600,000 or so active, and maybe 400,000 that were kind of on deck. So really, they had a military force of 1,000,000. So you have 1,000,000 against 140,000. Immediately, the Russians realized that they weren't going to be able to cover the front line with 140,000. So they retreated from a lot of areas that they had come into, and they had taken lines which they could defend. And little by little, they were beefing up their military forces. First, they had soldiers who were pulled from the prisons, and so these were the ones that helped win the city of Bakhmut. It was a very disastrous as far as casualties, but they were winning this. They were taking territory. They were winning, but it was exhausting the Russians. And then the Russians began to get better military leadership, better military equipment, and they began to take the offensive in this conflict, and they took it up until today. So anyway, the Ukrainian military is in very bad shape. They are running out of soldiers. They're running out of military equipment. They're running out of money. They are mobilizing people one day, and those people are on the front lines in 2 or 3 days. They barely have enough time how to learn how to use a rifle and use a radio and a few other things, and they're there on the front line. So the casualty numbers are getting higher and higher, and the casualty rate is getting higher because the soldiers don't have experience, and so we are looking at a catastrophic situation for the Ukrainian military. They probably have about a year left, so they can still win some localized battles, but they will win some territory, and then Russia will win it right back. Well, anyway, if anyone has been following this conflict, you'd realize that Ukraine is in a very bad situation, and it's only getting worse for them. And now they're mobilizing, or they're recruiting 60-year-olds. So if you're 60 years old, you don't have the physical capability, you don't have the mental capability, and the front lines is not where you should be. You should be getting your pension payment and enjoying your time with your family, but not going to the front lines. So these are the new soldiers that they're going to recruit and send to the front lines. So the rate, a casualty rate, is going to go higher and higher. And you know that the Russians have a huge advantage in their artillery, maybe 6 or 10 to 1, and the artillery is responsible for 80% of the casualties. And so now what Ukraine is doing is they're looking for these miracle weapons, kind of like what the Nazi Germany was doing at the end of World War II. They had the Nazi Germany had the V2s, and they had these weapons were like sound, and it would stop the soldiers in their tracks, and they couldn't advance if they used sound as kind of a wall, and they would push soldiers back. They came up with all kinds of ingenious military inventions, but it wasn't enough to change the basic fundamentals of the battle and why they were losing. So anyway, but now we're starting to see the Ukrainians fall into the same thing. They're looking at, long range missiles, deep strikes into the deepest parts of Russia, and they're looking at, robots. And robots can be helpful, but they don't replace soldiers. And robots have batteries. The battery will eventually run out, and if they don't get the robot to some place where it can juice up, then it's basically DOA. So anyway, we have very bad situation in Ukraine, and this was confirmed by the Department of the Defense of Russia, talking about Kupiansk. They've taken about 60% of the city, 5,667 buildings out of 8,667 buildings, and they have a large number of Ukrainian troops trapped. So they're either going to be destroyed or they will surrender. So anyway, they will lose those troops, and little by little, Ukraine is being demilitarized and denazified. But anyway, we're now starting to get these delusional stories coming out of President Trump about what the Ukrainian military can do, and we're also seeing escalation. So regarding escalation, President Trump is saying that NATO can now shoot down any Russian aircraft, which supposedly violated NATO airspace, and they're going to defend every last inch of NATO territory. Well, that's so stupid, especially if the airspace that one plane the Russians fly through, they understand that airspace is neutral, and the NATO countries understand that as their territory. So if you're not even talking with the Russians and you think that's your territory and the Russians think it's neutral space, well, you're going to have a conflict, and that could go south really fast. But anyway, I want to get to a Truth Social post here briefly and talk a little bit about how this whole situation with President Trump and his perception of the war is going from bad to worse. So here's a Truth Social post after all his meetings with all these hyped up NATO officials and all these warmongers in European countries. And so he says, after getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russia military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it is causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. So this is the most delusional thing that President Trump has said since the start of his presidency. Why? Because in the summer offensive of 2023, when they had a lot more soldiers, they had all the new and shiny military equipment given to them by the NATO countries, by the United States, and they threw that all up against the defensive line of Russia, and most of that was wiped out. They never recovered from that. They didn't recover the military equipment, the number of soldiers. They haven't been able to replace the soldiers that they lost and continue to lose. So where is he getting this idea from? Anyway, this is an extremely delusional statement from President Trump, and I'm starting to think now that he's being surrounded by this Colonel Kurtz, who was shown in the Apocalypse Now movie. Let me pull a couple of phrases from Colonel Kurtz. Maybe they sound familiar now. Maybe President Trump will start putting them in his True Social post. But he says, "Horror has a face, and you must make a friend of horror. Horror and moral terror are your friends." So anyway, this starting to sound like the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Ukraine has lost over 1 million soldiers, probably somewhere between 1 million and 1,000,008, 800,000 soldiers. The losses are tremendous. It's decimated their country, decimated their economic life, their future, and yet President Trump is pushing them on to give every last ounce of blood. And why? Well, I can tell you why. Because the United States is very interested in Ukraine. It's been interested in Ukraine since 1995. They put over 300 billion into Ukraine. We got the CIA took over the Ukrainian FSB, which is like their KGB, in 2014 after the Maidan Revolution. They're directing their military from Germany. They're providing them directly with satellite assistance, with military instructions. They provide them with the targets to hit with their missiles. They're providing guidance to the missiles that they send into Russia. So the United States is all over this war. If someone tells you that the United States is just a neutral observer, then you realize that that person is either lying or completely uninformed. But anyway, let me continue on with this post. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, yes, the countries that are going bankrupt, and in particular NATO, which doesn't have any financial any income of its own, except that comes from the U.S. and the NATO countries. The original borders from where this war started is very much an option. So here he's stating the same thing again, and this is a delusional statement. Also, the idea of shooting down Russian planes is another delusional statement. If you think that NATO is just going to shoot down Russian planes and Russia's just not going to do anything about it, you're wrong. They've already promised that they will respond in kind, probably directly to the country that attacked them. So, anyway, and the U.S. said it will back up the NATO countries. So, this puts us directly in a path of conflict with Russia, which we've been trying to avoid since 1945, because we know that if Russia and the U.S. get in a conflict, or back then it was basically the Western countries against the Soviet Union, it would be either one or the other. But now that you introduce nuclear weapons into the picture, then it's none. Basically, nobody wins. So, anyway, not too sure why President Trump is so deluded with these statements, but anyway, I continue on. Why not? Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, a war that it should have taken a real military power less than a week to win. So here he's both insulting Russia, and he's basically showing that he totally misunderstands the way this war is being run and what are the objectives of the special military operation. So this is another very unfortunate sign. We're starting to wonder what he is taking as far as meds. Is he starting to get off his rocker? So this is a really worrisome sign. It says Russia has been fighting aimlessly. So aimlessly means that they have that they're basically fighting like the U.S. fought in Vietnam or Afghanistan. So no, Russia doesn't fight that way. They have very specific targets. They have a way of going about the way they fight this war. But this isn't a war fighting for territory. This is a attritional war. So Russia wears down Ukraine, wears down their military forces and their military equipment, their military industrial complex, until they don't have any more soldiers, they don't have any more military equipment, they don't have any more factories to churn out weapons, and there's no weapons coming from outside. So the Ukraine military is running out of soldiers, so that's probably where they're first gonna get hurt. But anyway, as far as seeing an end to this war. So, but anyway, then now Trump calls Russia a paper tiger. So another insult. We've come a long way from Alaska, but I believe I said in the video about the Alaska meeting that this was just uh, a song and a dance. This was to wine and dine President Putin so that he would agree to a really bad deal. And he saw right through that. He said, "No way, I'm not going with your deal." And then the U.S. sat around and listened to the Russian story, but it never registered. So anyway, they were not only there to try to convince the Russians to sign an agreement that wasn't in their favor. They also pretended like they were listening when they weren't. So anyway, um, then he goes on to talk about the collapse of the war economy in Russia. Russia is spending about 6% of its GDP on the special military operation, so it's by no means a war operation. And there's no long lines for gasoline, at least in any of the videos I've seen from Russia. Um, so, anyway, President Trump is getting information from somewhere that's completely deluded, and we're starting to get these phrases. We're starting to see the real President Trump. Is President Trump the Colonel Kurtz we saw from Apocalypse Now? It's certainly starting to come into picture, but anyway, we know that the U.S. has lost several major wars in the last 50 years. We lost the Vietnam War. We lost the Afghan War. We lost basically the Iraq conflict. We totally misunderstood the whole conflict in Iraq and the situation there between the two the Shiites and the Sunnis. And once that kind of a civil war started, we got caught in the middle, and then people said, "Hey, we're getting out of here." So basically, driving around in a Humvee is not fighting a war or winning a war, and that's what it seems like we're really good at: bringing over a lot of Humvees, a lot of big trucks, driving around the country from one end to the other. We don't understand the language. We don't understand the situation. We don't know how to win the battle, and in the end, we lose. So anyway, it's clear to me that we're heading towards a loss in Ukraine, and Russia will just continue on. But we know that the NATO countries will continue to try to escalate and to bring the United States into the war. If that happens, this could go really bad really fast. And so we'll keep an eye on this. But it is so strange that the U.S. But that Russia has been flying jets from Russia to Kaliningrad, which is this enclave trapped between Poland and Lithuania, since 1991, and suddenly they have problems with Russia jets flying through the airspace. Okay, so we know between that and the foam dummy drones that they found in Ukraine, we don't know how they got there. And this whole the whole made up incident with the GPS jamming with van der Leyen, and as she was arriving to Bulgaria, which was a totally made up story, and people are still repeating that as if it was true or real or there was any truth to that story. So we know that these so-called escalatory measures on the part of Russia are really efforts on the part of NATO to escalate this conflict and to draw the United States in. So we will keep an eye on this conflict, but I think we're going to a very bad place, and we're going there very quickly. So President Trump, who could have ended this war on January 20th by cutting off the CIA, the money, the Starlink, all the satellite feeds, all the all the military direction from Germany. He could have cut all that off, and Ukraine would have been forced to negotiate. But as it is, Ukraine still continues to feel backed by the United States, and now it feels like it was going to win the war and take back the 1991 borders, which is a total delusion. So like I say, we're starting to see this Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now appearing with all these funny phrases. um, that Colonel Kurtz said, and we're starting to get these funny phrases from President Trump, all these delusional statements, and so anyway, this is going to a very bad place, and I don't want to make any predictions, but um, I'm really shocked that President Trump, who could have ended this war so easily, decided not to. So anyway, I'm disappointed with President Trump and his poor effort to end this war. And so we will continue to see escalation, and we don't know where this is going to go, but it's going to go a very, very dark place, probably very quickly now that President Trump has met with the NATO leaders, and certainly they have a plan. So we don't know what the plan is, but they're looking for trouble. So anyway, this is my report for today, Tuesday, September 23rd. Thank you for joining me. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share. I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.